Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to answer a typical question in business English exams. These questions often occur also in TOEFL exams and in IELTS exams as well. And it's a question that examiners often like to ask in exams, and that's describing trends, number and statistics, and describing some kind of chart or diagram or graph. And what I'm going to do in this video is talk you through the different steps for completing this task, and also to help you get good points and good grades on this part of the exam. It's really, in some ways, it's a gift for you because there are certain procedures you can go through and you can pick up these points, pick up these points, pick up these points. So I'm going to talk you through the different steps that you should go through in answering this question, so step by step. And the first step is to talk about the graph or the diagram in general terms. Then you will talk about the trends in specific terms, and this will be talking about the trend itself or writing about the trend itself, talking about or writing about the type of the change, and also probably the time of the change. At the same time, or as the next step, you might want to give the reasons for these changes, or you might be asked to give the reasons for these trends and changes. You might be asked to give some kind of comparison, and then you may want to give some kind of conclusions. So let's go through this procedure step by step by step. And the first thing is to talk about the diagram or the graph or the chart in very, very general terms. And in general terms, what you want to do first of all is describe what kind of diagram it is. And I'm going to give you a few examples here. So the first one that I've got is a pie chart. Now, a pie chart, if you're talking about the pie chart, then the different parts of the pie chart will be segments. It could be a bar chart, and a bar chart will have different columns. But very typically, what examiners like to do is give you some kind of line graph. Now what you want to do then is say what this line graph is all about in general terms. So this line graph represents the sales in the time period 2005 to 2010. On a line graph then you might want to describe then what the different axes represent. So the vertical axis represents the volume of sales, and the horizontal axis represents the time period from 2005 to 2010. It could be on a line graph that there are different kinds of lines. It could be they're different in colour. They could be red, blue, orange. They could be different in signs in terms of characteristics. So here, for example, I've given you the example of a solid line, a dotted line, and a dash line. And you should then go on to describe what that line outlines or depicts, again in general terms. So the solid line represents X, Y, Z. The dotted line depicts X, Y, Z, and the dash line outlines X, Y, Z, A. Now the other thing you might want to do if you're describing the diagram in general terms then is to talk about where the material came from. And sometimes the source is actually given with the diagram itself. And to give you some examples here, what I've done is write some example sentences. So you could say, for example, this graph diagram is taken from the annual report. This graph diagram was produced by the Department of Trade. This graph diagram is reproduced from the XYZ research. So this is describing the graph or the diagram in general terms. And in actual business life, you would be doing this too. If you were presenting a graph or a chart, you would explain it in general terms so that people can understand the chart, so they can understand the numbers and the trends and the results of the trends that you're giving to them. Now let's go on to the specifics. And the first is to talk about the trend itself. And there are different kinds of trends. We've got upward trends, downward trends. We've got very fast upward trends, very fast downward trends. We've got stability, we've got fluctuation, we've got high points, we've got low points. And you need to have enough vocabulary in order to describe these different trends. And if we take English as a language, the one thing we can say about English is it's really, really rich in vocabulary terms. And for each trend, I would go through the trends and make sure that you have 3, 4, or 5 expressions for each trend. This will be enough, I think, for any exam or any kind of assessment. As you go on through your career then, you may want to go back to these 4 or 5 expressions, and you might want to build in new expressions and keep extending your vocabulary. But in the first instance, I would stick to around about 3 or 5. So let's go to these trends. And the first one I want to look at then is a general upward trend. So what I'm going to do with each of these trends is give you verbs. And here I've got the verbs, and you probably know all of them or most of them. We've got climb, increase. We've got an irregular verb, grow, grew, grown. And then we've got jump and we've got rise. Rise is also irregular. Rise, rose, risen. Now here I would like to talk about the 2 verbs rise and raise. The first thing to recognize is they're two completely different verbs. Rise is an irregular verb. It's rise, rose, risen. And raise is a regular verb. Raise, raised, raised. And the 2 verbs are used in different ways. So the first thing is let's take raise. Raise is what we call a transitive verb. This is a grammatical term. It basically means that the verb has to have an object. Somebody has to raise something. So for example, the company raised the prices. The government raised the taxes. Now, if we take rise, this is used in a different way because rise is what we call an intransitive verb. It doesn't have an object after the verb. And if we take the 2 examples that we just had, you don't mention the person who's actually doing the increasing, or the body or the institution doing the increasing. So here you would have, for example, taxes rose. Now, if you're really happy and you're really familiar with the use of the verbs rise and raise, then I would show in an exam or an assessment that you can do that. And I would use the 2 different verbs and show I know what transitive and intransitive is. However, if you're confused and you're in an exam and you're really forgetting the difference between rise and raise, then again, English is so rich in vocabulary, then I would forget rise and raise and just use other vocabulary. So this was a general upward trend. Now let's move on to a general downward trend. And the 5 expressions I have here are drop, and then a couple of irregular verbs, fall, fell, fallen, shrink, shrank, shrunk, deteriorate, decrease. I sometimes, in my head, I think downward trends can be easy to remember because they often do start with these D words. So drop, deteriorate, decrease. Now deteriorate, if you're not sure of the meaning of deteriorate, it means basically to get worse. Now what I've given you here with upward and downward trends is a list of verbs, and verbs of course can also be nouns. If we take increase, fall, rise, these are also nouns. And when you're writing an exam or an assessment, I would mix up the use of verbs and the use of nouns. So sometimes the noun is exactly the same as the verb. Increase, rise, drop, decrease, fall. Sometimes it changes. So deteriorate, for example, becomes deterioration. Now an upward trend doesn't only have to be like this, it can also be like this. And we have some really nice verbs and expressions that we can use for this dramatic upward trend. And again, I've found you 5 examples. I've got rocket, shoot up. Again, this is an irregular verb. Shoot up, shot, shot up, shot up. Soar, take, again an irregular verb that you should know. Take, took, taken. And go, another regular verb, go, went, gone. It went through the roof. These are for a dramatic upward trend. And then if we turn to a dramatic downward trend, the opposite, then we've got plunge, plummet, crash, collapse, nosedive. So besides upwards and downward trends, we can also have trends that go across. And one of these trends that goes across is the aspect of being stable. It's the aspect of stability. So let's look at some vocabulary for stability. And the 5 examples I've given you here are remain steady, to even out, to level off, to remain stable, hold, firm. Again, an irregular verb, hold, held. This across movement, this horizontal movement, can also be fluctuation. And I've got some verbs here for you, or some expressions here for you. Fluctuate, be volatile, go up and down, to rise and fall. So we've got other movements. One of them can be a high point like this. And a high point, that can be a peak, or it can be to peak, to reach a peak, to reach a high point. And the other movement we've got is a low point like this, and this can be to hit a low simply, or to dip. And the final trend that we can look at is when a trend or numbers reach a low point for a longer period of time. And when you have this longer period of time, we can say this is to bottom out, or it's a bottoming out. It's a plateau, or to plateau. And the next word some people find difficult to pronounce, a trough. And when you've had a low point and the numbers begin to rise again, or the trend begins to change again and go upward, then you can use words for getting better. So to improve, to recover, to pick up, and to get better. So these are the different kinds of trends that you can talk about. And again, vary your vocabulary and learn vocabulary for each kind of trend. This will also save you time in the exam. If you have the vocabulary, as we say, at your fingertips, then you can easily call on the expressions that you need to use and concentrate on completing the tasks in the exam. Once you've identified the trend, then you can identify the type of trend. And if we talk about the type or the nature of the trend, there are 2 basic different kinds of type. And one is the size of the size of the change, and this is going from very big to very small, or it's to do with the speed of the change going from very slow to very fast. And again, you need a range of vocabulary at your fingertips to describe these trends, these types of trend. And the first one I'd like to look at is the size of the trend, and I've put this into this diagram here. So going from the biggest trend, we're going from dramatically to sharply, to steeply, to substantially, to significantly, to noticeably, to minimally. Then if we go on to the speed of change, then we're going from the slow to the fast. So go slowly, gradually, steadily, suddenly, swiftly, quickly, and the fastest, rapidly. Now, as you can see here, in both cases, I've given you adverbs. Just to recap, adverbs and adjectives. Adverbs describe a verb and adjectives describe a noun. Now, this is probably not so important in speaking, but if you're doing a written exam or a written assessment, then I would show as well that you can use adjectives and adverbs. So if you're using, for example, increase as a verb, then you would use the adverb. Sales increased slowly. If you're using increase as a noun, then you will use an adjective, and that's basically usually just taking the ly off. There was a rapid increase in prices. Now, the next thing you might want to do then is talk about the numbers themselves. And if you're talking about the numbers themselves, after the trend and the type of the trend, or together with those two things, then you need to really think about and show that you can use the right prepositions. Again, this can only help you get better grades. Now let me give you some examples. Let's take increase. Now increase, this would be true of decrease, rise, fall, and so on. I'm just giving increase as an example. Now if I have a number and I'm using increase as a noun, and I have a number following that, then the preposition I will use is of. So there was an increase of 5% in prices. There was a price reduction of £3. There was a dramatic decrease of 10,000. Now, if I use a thing or just a noun after the increase, then the preposition will be in. There was an increase in sales. There was a dramatic fall in prices. There was a steady rise in taxes. Again, typically if you're talking about going from one number to another number, then you simply use from and to. So prices increased from 10 to 25. Now, if I want to describe the difference of 15 between 10 and 25, the preposition that I use is by. So if if I take 10 and 25, it increased by 15 to 25. Now, when we come to specifics about trends, the other thing that I would pay attention to is the use of English tenses in your description. And when you do this, first of all, I would really examine the timeline that you've been given. Many exams will fix everything firmly in the past. And if everything's in the past, you're going to be a little bit limited on the tenses that you use. Everything mostly will be in the simple past tenses. But one of the things you can ask is something going right from the past to the future. And one of the things an examiner can be testing then is the use of the tenses. So let's look at an example. So again, with a past line going from the past to now to the future. Now these should, again, if you're doing business English, these tenses should be familiar to you, but let's briefly go through them. So if I'm looking at a graph and I'm talking about the past, so today, and then I'm talking about in 2010. In 2010, the tense that I will use is the simple past tense. It's finished and it's complete. So sales rose dramatically in 2010. The company decreased its prices in 2010. Now, if I talk about now, something happening right now, and I look at the present tenses, the tense that I'll use is the present, most probably the present continuous tense, or some people call this the present progressive tense. And the reason I'm using the progressive tense, the ing form, is because the situation, it's a trend. By its very nature, it's changing. It was different in the past and it will be different in the future, and it's something happening right now. It's a temporary situation. So again, if I look at this graph and I take the now line, which is the red dotted line, then I can say at the moment sales are rising gradually. Sales are climbing steadily. Now, if I take the timeline from the past to the present, so it's something that is still happening in the present, or it's something that has an effect on the present, the tense, of course, that I should be using is the present perfect tense. So again, taking this example, if I go back to the graph, and I can go from 2010 to now. So since 2010, sales have increased gradually and steadily. Now, if we go to the future, there are two basic tenses that we can use, and these, of course, are will and be going to. And when we're talking about forecasts and prediction, very often, or mostly, the tense that we will use is the very simple will form. Sales will rocket in the future. However, we can sometimes, when we're forecasting and predicting, we can also use the be going to form. And the be going to form, we can use it when we're very confident of our figures and our numbers and our statistics. So we're confident that sales are going to rocket. Let's take another example. There's a very big difference if I'm presenting, for example, and I'm speaking to the director of my company and I say sales will rise in China in the next 5 years. There's an element of doubt there. But if I say sales are going to rise in China in the next 5 years, that sounds more certain and more sure. So you can, if you want to as well, show that you can use the difference between will and be going to. Of course, another thing that we can use in forecasting and predicting as well are verbs in the present tense, but they indicate that you're forecasting. So verbs like we forecast, we predict, we expect, we anticipate. Another tense that you might want to show that you can use it is, especially if your graph is completely in the past, you might want to take the opportunity to show that you can use the past perfect. So the past perfect is the form with had and the past participle, had increased. And the past perfect is when you're already in the past and you want to go further back in the past. So I could say, for example, sales increased dramatically in 2010. Before that, they had plateaued. Okay, so let's move on to the next step that you may want to cover in your descriptions. You may be asked in the exam as well to give the reasons for the changes. And sometimes on the graph they put little diagrams and they show the reason for something changed, for some change, or you can use your imagination and express the reason for the changes. And again, it's a test of your English just to make sure that you have enough vocabulary to express these reasons. So, for example, sales rocketed last year. The reason for this was the introduction of the XYZ product. This was due to the introduction to the XYZ product. Sales rocketed because we introduced the XYZ product. The other thing that can happen as well is sometimes you're given in a graph, a line graph, you're given 2 lines or maybe even 3 lines, and you are asked, or you can compare the lines with each other. I'll be showing you an example of this from an IELTS paper in a moment or two. Now, the final step that you may want to take then is to make some kind of conclusions, overall conclusions from the graph. So we can conclude that it's necessary to change the products every 1 to 2 years. In conclusion, I recommend making changes to the product every 1 or 2 years, something like this. Okay, so what we've looked at here then is what's the procedure? What's that step-to-step procedure so that you can show the organization of your materials, the organization of your knowledge, and to show that you can use English, you can use a variety of English, and you can use English grammatically and correctly. So first of all, describe the chart or the diagram or the graph in general terms. Then describe it in specific terms. So the trend, the type of trend, and the timeline of the trend. Then you may want to talk, or you may be asked to talk about the reasons for the changes. You may be asked to make some kind of comparisons between different trends and changes. And then you can make conclusions, your overall conclusions. So shall we look at an example of this? And what I'd like to do is take an example from IELTS, which is a proficiency test for English for higher education that you might be familiar with. And I've taken this is from some example papers that are available on the IELTS website. I'll put the link in the description below. And I'd like to show you a typical example of what we're talking about. Okay, so let's go through this task. The first thing when you're given an exam question is read the task. Really check what you're being asked to do. Now, there are some very good guidelines here, very detailed guidelines. So it's a writing task. You're given the time specifically, you're told to spend about 20 minutes on the task. So if you find that you're going into 25 minutes doing this task, I would stop the task and complete it. Then there's quite a lot of detail about the graph. It represents radio and television audiences throughout the day. So from 6 a.m. to 6 a.m., so a 24-hour period in 1992. And then it tells you to summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features. So you don't need to describe every little single curve in the diagram, and make comparisons where relevant. And you've been told to write at least 150 words. Forget the word count. Try and get the task done in about 20 minutes. Don't spend your time in an exam counting words. I've seen people do this in an exam, and people are more worried about the number of words that they've written than actually about what they've written. So just try and complete the task in about 20 minutes and forget the word count. So let's try and go through describing this diagram in the step-to-step approach that we went through before. So this is a line graph that represents the radio and television audience in the United Kingdom in the last quarter of 1992. The vertical axis depicts the percentage of the UK population in percentage terms. The horizontal axis shows a timeline in a 24-hour period from 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. There are two lines on the graph. The dashed line shows the television audience, and the dotted line shows the radio audience. So first of all, let's have a look at the radio audience. The radio audience at 6 a.m. was below 10%. As people began to wake up and to get ready for work and school and university, the audience rose significantly, and reached a peak at around about 8:30, just below 30%. From that point, the radio audience fell significantly but gradually until around about 2 o'clock in the morning. There was a significant dip at around about 2:30 in the afternoon. This is probably when people begin to take their lunch. And a slight rise or peak in the audience at around about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when people returned from work and study. In the early hours of the morning at 2 o'clock, the radio audience almost reached zero and bottomed out. Now let's have a look at the television audience. So the television audience was at zero at 6 a.m. in the morning. As people got up again, the television audience rose in the hours between 7 and 8:30 in the morning. Then the audience declined slightly and dipped, but from around about 10:30 in the morning to about 8 o'clock at night, the numbers climbed dramatically and reached a significant peak at 8 o'clock in the evening at 50%. From this point, the audience declined minimally, but at around about 10 o'clock, the audience fell, or it plunged dramatically and bottomed out in the period between 2 and 6 o'clock in the morning when people were asleep. If we compare the two charts, we can see that the television audience reached a peak and that the audience was much higher during the afternoon and the early evening. And this indicates that in the afternoon and in the evening, from about lunchtime onwards, that more people tended to watch television than listen to the radio. However, in the early hours of the morning, we can see that the radio audience reached its peak of nearly 30%. At the same time, the television audience only rose slightly and dipped shortly afterwards, and this would indicate that more people, as they have things to do in the morning, that more people listened to the radio than watched television. So this is all I wanted to say in this video. You may want to look at my other videos to do with money and to do with finance, which will also help you in describing these numbers and trends. And in future videos, I do plan to give you some information about talking about economics, which will also help you with this kind of question. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.